James, a well-dressed black man in his early 40s, walked into a luxury car dealership in Beverly Hills. He had his eye on the latest Rolls-Royce Phantom, a car he had dreamed of owning for years. But as he stepped inside, he couldn't ignore the cold stares and dismissive attitude from the sales team. It was clear they didn't think he belonged there. James walked confidently into the Beverly Hills dealership, his tailored blazer and polished shoes reflecting his understated elegance. He stopped for a moment, admiring the sleek design of a Rolls-Royce Phantom glinting under the showroom lights. It was the car he'd been dreaming of for years, a symbol of his hard-earned success. As he approached the reception desk, the chatter among the sales staff quieted. All eyes were on him, but not with the respect or professionalism one might expect in such an establishment. Brad, a salesman with a sharp suit and sharper tongue, broke the silence. "Can I help you?" Brad's tone was flat with an undercurrent of skepticism. James smiled politely. "Yes, I'm interested in the Rolls-Royce Phantom. Could you tell me more about it?" Brad hesitated, giving James a once-over. "The Phantom starts at $450,000. Are you sure that's what you're looking for?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. James didn't flinch. "Yes, I'm sure. It's a beautiful car, and I'd like to see it up close." Brad exchanged a knowing look with another salesman. "I'm sorry, but we usually reserve showings for serious buyers. These aren't exactly starter cars, if you know what I mean." A faint chuckle came from another employee nearby, and James's smile began to fade. Despite his calm demeanor, the sting of Brad's words was impossible to ignore. "I see," James replied, his voice steady but tinged with disappointment. "And what makes you think I'm not serious?" Brad leaned against a nearby desk, crossing his arms. "Look, we get a lot of people who just want to take pictures for Instagram. If you're serious about buying, we'd need some proof." James glanced around the showroom, noting the amused faces of the staff and the growing tension in the air. He took a deep breath, suppressing the urge to respond in anger. Instead, he nodded. "Well, thank you for your time," James said, his voice measured. "I'll be back." As he walked out of the dealership, the laughter behind him grew louder. Brad turned to his colleagues, shaking his head. "Another dreamer wasting our time," he muttered. Unbeknownst to Brad, James was about to return, not with words, but with an undeniable statement of who he truly was. James stepped out into the bright Beverly Hills sun, his mind racing with a mix of anger and determination. He wasn't a man who tolerated disrespect, especially when it stemmed from ignorance and prejudice. Standing by the curb, he made a quick call. Moments later, a sleek black SUV pulled up, driven by his personal assistant, Michael. "Everything okay, Mr. Carter?" Michael asked, sensing the tension. James nodded and opened the key back door, retrieving a large, sturdy briefcase. He placed it on the seat beside him for a moment, carefully unlocking it to check its contents. Stacks of neatly arranged $100 bills, enough to buy not one, but several of the cars in the dealership. "It's time to make a statement," James said, his calm voice belying the fire in his eyes. He closed the case with a satisfying click, then turned to Michael. "Wait here, this won't take long." Re-entering the dealership, James felt every pair of eyes lock onto him. The room fell silent as the amused whispers were replaced with curiosity. With slow, deliberate steps, he walked up to Brad, who was now leaning casually against a desk, scrolling. On his phone, Brad looked up, his smirk returning. "Back already? Change your mind about that starter car?" Without a word, James placed the briefcase on the desk in front of Brad and flipped it open. The room seemed to hold its breath as the sight of crisp green bills spilled out. "This," James said, his voice steady but commanding, "is $500,000 in cash. Enough to pay for that Phantom you didn't think I could afford, and then some." The color drained from Brad's face as he struggled to find words. Other employees gathered around, their jaws dropping at the sight. "I told you I was serious," James continued, his tone sharp but composed. Now let's see if this dealership is serious about treating customers with respect." The room remained frozen, with the weight of James's words sinking in. Brad's arrogance had suddenly turned into embarrassment, and for the first time, he was at a loss for his usual condescending remarks. As James stood there, calm but resolute, it became clear to everyone present this was no ordinary customer. The tension in the room was palpable as James calmly closed the briefcase, his gaze never leaving Brad's stunned face. Before the flustered salesman could respond, the dealership manager, Mr. Howard, emerged from his office, drawn by the commotion. "What's going on here?" Mr. Howard asked, his authoritative tone cutting through the silence. Brad stammered, trying to regain composure. This gentleman—" "Here," James interrupted, his voice steady but commanding. "Your salesman assumed I couldn't afford to buy a car and refused to even show me the model I asked for. Is that how you treat your customers here?" The manager's face darkened as he glanced between James and the open briefcase on the desk. He immediately recognized the situation for what it was: a colossal mistake. "Mr. the manager began, extending a hand to James. "Carter," James replied, shaking his hand firmly. "James Carter." At the mention of his name, "Mr." Howard's eyes widened in recognition. "James Carter, the real estate mogul." "That's right," James said, his tone cool. "I was here to purchase a car today in cash, but it seems your team didn't think I was qualified." The room grew even quieter as the weight of the revelation sank in. James Carter wasn't just wealthy. He was one of the most successful real estate developers in California. His name frequently appeared in business magazines and high-profile charity events. Mr. Howard turned to Brad, his expression a mix of anger and disbelief. "Brad, is this true? Did you refuse to show Mr. Carter the car he requested?" Brad, now visibly sweating, tried to defend himself. I didn't know who he was. I just thought—" "You thought wrong," Mr. Howard snapped, cutting him off. "This is unacceptable. Our dealership prides itself on respect and professionalism, and you've failed on both counts." Turning back to James, the manager's tone softened. "Mr. Carter, on behalf of the dealership, I deeply apologize for this misunderstanding. Please allow me to personally assist you in selecting any vehicle you like. The Phantom, of course, is available." James held up a hand, silencing the manager's apologies. "I appreciate your words, but I don't need special treatment. I just wanted to be treated like any other customer." He paused, letting his words hang in the air before continuing. "And I want Brad here to process the sale. Let's see if he's capable of doing his job right." Brad's face turned a deeper shade of red, but he nodded, realizing he had no choice. The staff watched in silence as James's quiet authority took over, turning the situation into a powerful lesson in humility and professionalism. The dealership floor was now a flurry of activity, with employees scrambling to assist James while trying to avoid his sharp gaze. Brad, still shaken, retrieved the necessary paperwork for the sale. His usual confidence was nowhere to be found as he fumbled with the forms, his hands trembling slightly. James, however, remained calm and collected, observing the entire process with a quiet intensity. The other employees watched from a distance, their curiosity mixed with unease. As Brad returned with the forms, James leaned back in his chair, the briefcase of cash still resting on the desk. "Before we proceed, Brad, I have a question for you," James said, his tone firm but not hostile. Brad swallowed hard. "Yes, sir?" "Why did you assume I couldn't afford this car?" James asked, his gaze piercing. Brad hesitated, struggling to find an answer. I made a mistake," he stammered. "I didn't mean to offend you." James tilted his head slightly. "Didn't mean to offend me, or didn't think I deserved your respect." Brad's face turned crimson as he realized there was no escaping the truth. "I was wrong, Mr. Carter. I judged you unfairly. And I'm sorry," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. James let the silence linger for a moment before nodding. "Acknowledging your mistake is a start, But remember, respect. It should never be based on someone's appearance. You work in a place where people come to realize their dreams. You should be part of that, not a barrier to it. The weight of James's words hit hard, not just for Brad, but for everyone within earshot. It was a reminder that prejudice, conscious or unconscious, had no place in professional or personal interactions. Brad completed the sale under James's watchful eye, each step a humbling reminder of his earlier misjudgment. When the final signature was placed, James stood and extended his hand. "Thank you for your apology," he said simply. "I hope you take this experience to heart." Brad shook his hand, visibly relieved but clearly humbled. With the keys to his brand new Rolls-Royce Phantom in hand, James turned to Mr. Howard. "I hope your dealership learns from this as well. Respect isn't optional. It's the foundation of any good business." As James exited the dealership, the staff stood silently, reflecting on what had just transpired. It wasn't just a lesson for Brad, it was a lesson for all of them. James stepped out of the dealership and into the bright California sunshine, his new Rolls-Royce Phantom gleaming as it was carefully driven to the front. He handed the keys to Michael, his assistant, who had been waiting patiently in the SUV. "You ready to head out, Mr. Carter?" Michael asked, a knowing smile on his face. James nodded. "Let's take this beauty for a spin. But first, one last thing." Before getting into his car, James turned back to the dealership, his voice calm but firm. "To everyone in there, remember, respect should never be tied to someone's appearance, race, or assumptions. You never know who's walking through that door or what they're capable of." The staff, now gathered near the entrance, watched. As James drove off, their expressions a mix of admiration and guilt. It wasn't just the sale of a car that had happened that day. It was the sale of a powerful message that dignity and respect are owed to all, regardless of who they are or where they come from. As the dealership fell back into its usual routine, Brad and the other employees couldn't shake the memory of James's poised demeanor and undeniable authority. It wasn't just the briefcase full of cash that had left an impression, it was the way he carried himself, refusing to let prejudice dictate his worth. James, now cruising through Beverly Hills in his dream car, allowed himself a small smile. The victory wasn't just in buying the car, it was in leaving behind a lesson that would resonate long after he was gone. And now, a question for you. Have you ever been underestimated or judged unfairly? Share your story in the comments. We'd love to hear it. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more inspiring stories like this one. See you in the next video!